In 2021, a team of scientists cracked open ancient bones expecting to confirm a theory that had stood for decades. Instead, they found something that shouldn't have been there, a genetic signature that didn't match anything in the official history of Japan. What they uncovered didn't just add a footnote to the story, it rewrote it. For most of the 20th century, historians and geneticists agreed on a simple story. The Japanese people, they said, descended from two ancestral groups. One was an ancient population of hunter-gatherers who had lived on the islands since the last ice age. The other was a wave of farmers who arrived from the Asian mainland thousands of years later, bringing rice cultivation, metal tools, and a completely different way of life. Two peoples, two migrations, one blended population. It was called the dual structure model, and for decades it was treated almost like settled fact. Textbooks taught it, museums displayed it. An entire national identity was built around it, but ancient DNA does not care about textbooks. When scientists began sequencing genetic material pulled directly from skeletons thousands of years old, the story started to crack. Buried in bones from 3 different time periods was a signal nobody had predicted, evidence of a population that seemed to come from nowhere, arriving on the islands long after the story was supposed to have already ended. It forced researchers to ask an unsettling question. What if the people living in Japan today were not the product of 2 ancestral groups, but 3? And if there was a 3rd group, who were they, and where did they come from? To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a population known as the Jomon. The Jomon were the original inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago, hunter-gatherers and fishers who lived on the islands for more than 10,000 years before farming ever arrived. They get their name from the cord-marked pottery they left behind, some of the oldest pottery ever discovered anywhere on Earth. Long before agriculture existed almost anywhere else in the world, the Jomon were making intricate ceramic vessels, carving tools from bone and stone, and building a way of life adapted almost perfectly to the forests, rivers, and coastlines around them. What makes the Jomon so scientifically fascinating is not just how long they survived, but how isolated they were while doing it. Roughly 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, rising sea levels began cutting Japan off from the rest of the Asian continent. Land bridges that once connected the archipelago to the mainland slowly disappeared beneath the water. The people living there found themselves increasingly separated from their continental relatives, stranded on a chain of islands with the ocean closing in around them. For thousands upon thousands of years, that isolation only deepened. Ancient genome analysis has shown something remarkable about this population. Their genetic diversity stayed remarkably narrow. Researchers estimate the effective population size of the Jomon hovered around just 1,000 individuals for millennia at a time. Think about that. An entire population thriving across the islands for over 10,000 years, while carrying the genetic signature of a group that never grew particularly large and rarely mixed with outsiders. Their DNA diverged from mainland Asian populations, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, a split so old and so distinct that modern geneticists can spot Jomon ancestry in a genome almost instantly, the same way you might recognize a rare fingerprint. For thousands of years, this was simply life in ancient Japan. Small, stable communities living off the sea and the forest, developing rich spiritual traditions, intricate art, and an intimate relationship with their environment, all while the rest of the world moved on without them. They built dwellings sunk partway into the earth for warmth, wove baskets and cords from plant fiber, hunted deer and wild boar in the surrounding forests, and harvested shellfish and fish from the coastlines that wrapped around nearly every settlement. Some Jomon sites show evidence of surprisingly settled village life, with the same locations occupied for generations, even centuries, despite the fact that these were hunter-gatherers rather than farmers. That kind of long-term settlement without agriculture is rare in the archaeological record almost anywhere else on Earth, and it is part of what makes the Jomon such an unusual case study for researchers, trying to understand how ancient societies actually functioned. Their isolation did not mean they were untouched by the outside world entirely. Small amounts of contact and trade likely continued across the narrow stretches of water separating Japan from the continent, and some genetic and archaeological evidence suggests occasional contact with populations from the Korean peninsula and beyond over the millennia. But these contacts were sporadic, nothing like the sustained population-altering migrations that would eventually follow. For the overwhelming majority of their existence, the Jomon developed on their own terms, insulated by geography, shaped by the specific resources and challenges of a chain of mountainous, forested islands surrounded by ocean on every side. That isolation is precisely why their genetic signature remains so distinct and so recognizable today, even after thousands of years of later mixing with other populations. Then, around 2,300 to 3,000 years ago, everything changed. A new population began arriving on the shores of Japan, and they did not come empty-handed. These newcomers, later called the Yayoi, brought wet rice farming, bronze and iron tools, and knowledge of continental technology that the Jomon had never encountered. This was not a slow trickle of a few wandering travelers. It was a transformation. Farming allowed populations to grow in ways that hunting and gathering simply could not sustain. Villages became larger, food surpluses appeared. Social structures grew more complex almost overnight, at least by the standards of ancient history. The Yayoi migration did not happen all at once, and it did not sweep across the islands uniformly. It began in the southwest, likely through the Korean Strait, and spread gradually outward over the following centuries. Along the way, it carried with it an entirely new economic foundation. Wet rice paddies required organized labor, irrigation systems, and long-term investment in a single piece of land, a dramatic shift away from the more mobile, resource-following lifestyle that Jomon had practiced for thousands of years. With farming came surplus food, and with surplus food came something ancient hunter-gatherer societies rarely needed at scale: storage, planning, and eventually hierarchy. Bronze and iron tools followed not long after, transforming everything from farming efficiency to warfare, and setting the stage for the more complex political structures that would define the centuries to come. As the Yayoi settled into the islands, they didn't simply replace the Jomon, who were already there. They mixed with them, intermarried with them, and gradually blended into a single genetically layered population. Geneticists can trace this mixture through Y chromosome haplogroups passed down through the male line, patterns that show clear signatures of both Jomon and Yayoi ancestry, surviving side by side in the same bloodlines for generations. This blending happened unevenly across the islands. In western Japan, where the earliest and largest waves of Yayoi migrants settled, their genetic influence runs deep. In places like Hokkaido in the north and Okinawa in the south, the older Jomon signature remained much stronger, less diluted by the newcomers pouring in through the south and west. This dual ancestry story, Jomon hunter-gatherers merging with Yayoi farmers, became the accepted explanation for Japanese origins for the better part of a century. It was elegant, it was intuitive. It matched the archaeological record of pottery styles changing, farming spreading, and population centers shifting. Scientists built entire careers refining the details of this model, mapping exactly how much Jomon ancestry showed up in different regions, tracing haplogroups across prefectures, comparing skull shapes and skeletal structures from burial sites scattered across the archipelago. For a long time, the only real debate was about the precise ratios, not whether the basic two-part framework was correct. Then, ancient DNA sequencing technology caught up to the questions scientists had been asking for decades, and the story stopped fitting neatly into two boxes. In September of 2021, a research team analyzed 12 ancient genomes recovered from sites spanning 3 distinct periods of Japanese history: the Jomon era, the Yayoi era, and a later period known as the Kofun period, named for the massive keyhole-shaped burial mounds that define it. The Kofun period runs roughly from the 3rd to the 7th century of the Common Era, a time when Japan was consolidating into powerful regional states, building elaborate tombs for its rulers, and forming the political foundations that would eventually become a unified imperial nation. When the researchers compared the genetic profiles from all 3 periods, something did not add up. The Kofun-era skeletons did not simply look like a continuation of the Yayoi population that came before them. They carried a distinct 3rd genetic signature, one that was not present in either the Jomon or the Yayoi individuals the team had already sequenced. This wasn't a subtle statistical anomaly buried in the data. The clustering was clear. Jomon individuals grouped together, Yayoi individuals grouped together, and the Kofun period individuals formed their own separate cluster entirely, one that lined up closely with modern Japanese populations living today. In other words, the ancestors of most people living in Japan right now were not simply Jomon hunter-gatherers blended with Yayoi rice farmers. There had been a 3rd wave, arriving centuries after the Yayoi migration was already considered complete, bringing an entirely new genetic contribution into the mix at almost exactly the same moment Japan was transforming from a patchwork of farming communities into an organized state-level society. This 3rd ancestral group appears to trace back to later migrations from the East Asian mainland, likely connected to the political and cultural exchanges that were reshaping the region during the Kofun period. Powerful clans were rising. Diplomatic and trade contact with continental kingdoms was intensifying. It was a period of enormous social upheaval, and the genetic evidence now suggests that upheaval came with an actual influx of new people, not just new ideas and new technology passed along trade routes. Picture what the Kofun period actually looked like on the ground. Enormous keyhole-shaped burial mounds, some stretching longer than 400 meters and visible even today from the air, were being constructed for powerful rulers, requiring the coordinated labor of thousands of workers laboring over years at a time, moving earth by hand on a scale rarely attempted anywhere else in the ancient world. Iron weapons and armor were becoming more sophisticated. Horse riding, largely unknown in earlier Japanese history, appears in the archaeological record around this same window. Writing systems and administrative practices borrowed from continental kingdoms began taking root among the ruling elite. All of this pointed toward a society undergoing rapid, almost compressed transformation, condensing changes that took other civilizations many centuries into a comparatively short and intense window of change. For a long time, historians assumed this transformation was purely cultural, the result of ideas, technologies, and trade goods moving across the sea while the underlying population stayed largely the same. The ancient genomes proved otherwise. The people themselves were changing too, not just their tools and their titles. What makes this discovery so striking is the timing. Cultural historians already knew the Kofun period was a turning point, the moment when scattered communities began consolidating into something resembling an early Japanese state, complete with powerful rulers, monumental architecture, and increasingly centralized political authority. But nobody had proof that this cultural transformation was accompanied by an actual demographic one. The genome data changed that. It showed that the shift from loosely connected farming villages to an organized hierarchical society happened at the exact same time a new population was arriving and weaving itself into the existing genetic fabric of the islands. This tripartite model, Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun, has now been supported by multiple independent research teams using different data sets and different ancient samples. A separate study led by Japanese researchers around the same time reached strikingly similar conclusions, reinforcing the idea that the old two-population framework, while not entirely wrong, was fundamentally incomplete. The Jomon and Yayoi were real. Their contributions to the modern Japanese gene pool are real and measurable, but they were only 2/3 of the actual story. Since that initial breakthrough, researchers have continued refining the picture, and the details keep getting more interesting. Scientists studying regional variation across Japan have found that the proportion of Jomon ancestry is not evenly distributed across the population. It rises and falls depending on geography, deeply influenced by exactly how much contact each region had with incoming Yayoi and Kofun populations thousands of years ago. The Ainu people of Hokkaido, in Japan's far north, carry some of the highest levels of Jomon ancestry found anywhere in the country, a genetic echo of communities that remained more isolated from the waves of migration sweeping through the southern and western islands. Similarly, the Ryukyu Islands in the far south, including Okinawa, show elevated levels of Jomon ancestry compared to mainland Japan, despite being separated from Hokkaido by nearly the entire length of the archipelago. Researchers analyzing historic genomes from the southern Ryukyu Islands found that the tripartite model fits well there too, but with significantly higher Jomon proportions than you find on the main islands, suggesting these communities absorbed less of the later migratory waves that reshaped the mainland population. The Ainu case is particularly striking because it connects directly to documented history, not just ancient bones. The Ainu maintained a distinct language, distinct spiritual practices, and a distinct way of life well into the modern era. And for a long time, their cultural differences from mainland Japanese populations were treated primarily as a matter of geography and history rather than deep ancestry. The genetic data adds a much sharper dimension to that story. It shows that the Ainu are not simply a regional variant of the same population found across the rest of Japan. They carry a substantially higher proportion of Jomon ancestry, a direct genetic echo of a population that experienced far less admixture with Yayoi and Kofun migrants than communities further south. In a very real sense, the Ainu represent one of the closest living genetic links to the original hunter-gatherers who occupied the islands more than 10,000 years ago. This regional patchwork tells its own story. It suggests that Japan was never genetically uniform, not in ancient times, and arguably not even today. Instead, the modern population is a mosaic, shaped by how each region experienced thousands of years of migration, isolation, farming expansion, and state formation differently. A person from Okinawa and a person from central Honshu may both be considered Japanese in every cultural and national sense, yet their deep ancestral makeup can differ in genuinely measurable ways, a difference written directly into their DNA by events that happened millennia before either of them was born. More recent research has pushed even further into the details, filling gaps that the original 2021 studies could not fully close. One challenge scientists faced for years was the lack of high-quality Yayoi genomes. Without solid genetic data from the Yayoi period itself, it was difficult to pin down exactly how much ancestry came from Yayoi migrants versus the later Kofun wave. In 2024, researchers sequenced the full genome of a Yayoi individual recovered from the Doigahama archaeological site in Yamaguchi Prefecture, one of the most important Yayoi burial sites ever excavated. The results showed that this individual, much like the later Kofun period people and modern mainland Japanese populations, already carried 3 distinct genetic ancestries: Jomon-related, broader East Asian, and a northeastern Siberian-related component. This added yet another layer of complexity to a story that was already far more complicated than the simple two-population model anyone had assumed for most of the 20th century. Not every research team agrees on the exact proportions, and that disagreement is part of what makes this such an active and exciting area of science. Some studies estimate the Yayoi population itself carried a mix of roughly 60% Jomon-related ancestry and 40% Northeast Asian ancestry, while other research suggests the genetic turnover during the Yayoi period was even more dramatic than that. These differences often come down to which specific skeletal remains were sampled, since individuals buried at different sites in different regions and at different points during the Yayoi period can show meaningfully different ancestry profiles. Ancient populations were not uniform blocks of identical people. They were living, moving, mixing communities, and the deeper scientists dig, the more that complexity reveals itself. Some researchers have even suggested that certain early Yayoi skeletons show unusually high levels of Jomon ancestry compared to the broader population, raising the possibility that these particular individuals were outliers rather than representative examples. Perhaps people from communities where intermarriage with local Jomon groups happened especially quickly after the migrants first arrived. If that is true, it means the overall genetic transition from Jomon-dominant to Yayoi-dominant populations may have happened somewhat faster and somewhat more unevenly than a single average number could ever fully capture. This is the kind of nuance that only becomes visible once you have enough ancient genomes to compare against each other directly, rather than relying on a handful of samples and extrapolating outward. Every new skeleton pulled from the ground and successfully sequenced has the potential to shift these percentages slightly, refine a timeline, or reveal a regional pattern nobody had previously considered. That is what makes this such a living, breathing area of science rather than a settled chapter in a textbook. The story of Japanese ancestry is still actively being written, one ancient genome at a time. What all of this ultimately means is that the story of Japanese origins is not a simple line connecting two dots. It is a layered history of isolation, migration, transformation, and repeated waves of contact with the outside world, each one leaving a permanent trace inside the DNA of the people living there today. The Jomon spent millennia essentially alone on their islands, developing one of the most distinctive and long-lasting hunter-gatherer cultures anywhere in the ancient world. The Yayoi arrived with farming and forever changed the trajectory of the population, allowing numbers to grow and society to complexify in ways that simply were not possible before. And then, centuries later, right as Japan was forging its first steps toward becoming a unified state, a third wave of people arrived from the mainland and wove themselves permanently into the genetic identity of the nation, largely unnoticed by history until ancient DNA sequencing finally caught up and revealed what had actually happened. It is worth pausing on just how significant this kind of discovery really is. For most of human history, the only tools available for understanding ancestry were archaeology, language, and physical anthropology, comparing pottery styles, tracking loanwords between languages, and measuring skull shapes from burial sites. Those methods gave researchers a rough sketch, but they could never definitively prove exactly how populations moved, mixed, and replaced one another over thousands of years. Ancient DNA changed everything. It gave scientists a direct, unambiguous record written into the biology of the people themselves, a record that cannot be reinterpreted or debated the way pottery styles sometimes can. And in the case of Japan, that record proved that a widely accepted decades-old theory, taught in schools and repeated in textbooks around the world, was fundamentally incomplete. This is also a reminder of something bigger than just Japanese history. Nearly every modern population on Earth carries a story like this buried in its genome, layers of migration, isolation, and mixing that most people never think about, because the people involved left no written records behind. The Jomon never wrote down their story, neither did the Yayoi, at least not in a form that survives today. It took thousands of years and the invention of genome sequencing technology for their true history to finally surface, hidden in fragments of bone that had been sitting in the ground the entire time, waiting for science to catch up. Consider how differently this story might have been told just 20 years earlier. Before ancient DNA sequencing became reliable and affordable enough to apply broadly, researchers were largely limited to comparing modern populations to each other and trying to extrapolate backward, guessing at ancient migrations based on the genetic patterns left behind in living people. That approach worked reasonably well for identifying broad strokes, but it struggled badly with resolution. It could tell you that Jomon and continental ancestry existed somewhere in the Japanese gene pool, but it could not tell you when a specific wave of migration happened, how large it was, or whether it was one event or several spread across centuries. Only by extracting genetic material directly from skeletons that lived through these events, dated with precision using radiocarbon methods, Could scientists finally place exact populations at exact moments in time and watch the transitions unfold sample by sample? That leap in precision is what turned a vague, decades-old theory into an evidence-based model with 3 clearly defined clusters, 3 measurable timeframes, and a level of confidence that simply was not possible using older methods. It is also worth remembering how much of this research is genuinely recent. The foundational studies establishing the tripartite model were published only a few years ago, and the field is moving quickly. Every genome added to the dataset sharpens the picture a little more, sometimes confirming earlier conclusions and sometimes complicating them in ways researchers did not expect. Science rarely delivers a finished answer all at once. It delivers a series of increasingly accurate approximations, each one built on the last, each one capable of overturning assumptions that once seemed unshakable. The dual ancestry model looked unshakable for the better part of a century. Then, a dozen ancient genomes were enough to show it was incomplete, and the story is still not finished. Every new genome sequence from an ancient burial site has the potential to add another layer of nuance, another regional variation, another piece of a puzzle that scientists once thought they had already solved. Researchers are continuing to excavate and analyze remains from across the Japanese archipelago, from the northern reaches of Hokkaido to the southernmost islands of Okinawa, refining the tripartite model with every new sample and occasionally challenging parts of it outright. What began as a straightforward 2-population theory has evolved into a genuinely 3-dimensional history, and there is a real possibility that future discoveries could reveal even more layers than the 3 currently known. There is something almost poetic about how this story came to light. For 1,500 years, the descendants of Jomon hunter-gatherers, Yayoi farmers, and Kofun-era migrants lived, married, and raised families across the Japanese archipelago without any written record of the deeper layers hidden inside them. Generation after generation passed the same combination of ancestries forward without anyone knowing it was there, encoded quietly in cells, invisible to the eye and untouched by any historical document. It took a laboratory, a sequencing machine, and a small number of carefully preserved skeletons to finally bring that hidden history into the light. In a way, the bones had been trying to tell this story all along. They simply needed the right technology to be heard. So the next time someone repeats the old idea that the Japanese people descend cleanly from 2 ancestral groups, hunter-gatherers and farmers, know that the science has already moved past that explanation. The real story is stranger, richer, and far more interesting. It involves a population that spent 20,000 years cut off from the rest of the world, a farming revolution that reshaped an entire society, and a mysterious third wave of migrants who arrived just as Japan was forging its identity as a nation, leaving a genetic signature that sat undetected for more than 1,500 years until ancient DNA finally forced historians to rewrite the textbook. It's a story that was never lost. It was simply waiting, encoded quietly in bone, for the science of today to finally read it. And as more ancient graves are opened, more genomes sequenced, and more regions of the archipelago studied in the same careful detail, there is every reason to believe the picture will keep sharpening, revealing not a fixed and final answer, but a history that continues to grow richer, stranger, and more human with every new discovery pulled from the earth.